They marched into battle wearing black hats that made them stand out not for show, but as a mark of death-defying courage. While other Union units broke and ran, these men stood firm, earning a name that would echo through history. The Iron Brigade? But who were they? And why did their enemies fear them more than any other soldiers in the Civil War? The year was 1861. The United States was tearing itself apart, and President Lincoln's call for volunteers had echoed across the North. In the small towns of Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan, farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers left their plows and anvils behind, signing up to fight for the Union. Few knew what real war was like. Most had never fired a rifle in anger, but they would soon learn. These men weren't professional soldiers. They were volunteers, raw and untested. But what set them apart was their discipline. While other Union regiments struggled with desertion and drunkenness, the men who would become the Iron Brigade drilled relentlessly under the summer sun. Their officers, many of them Mexican War veterans, knew that survival depended on cohesion. Marching in tight formations, loading and firing on command, these weren't just exercises. They were the difference between life and death. Then came the uniforms. While most Union troops wore standard blue, these men were issued distinctive black hardy hats, a mark of the regular army, not militia. The hats drew stares, even mockery at first, but soon they became a badge of pride. When other units saw those black hats coming, they knew these weren't just any soldiers. These were men who held their ground. Their first real test came in 1862 at the Battle of Bronner's Farm. Outnumbered and under fire from Confederate sharpshooters, they didn't retreat. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, trading volleys at point-blank range until darkness ended the fight. The Confederates, expecting another Green Union unit to break, were stunned. One Southern officer later wrote, "Those men fought like iron." The name stuck, but the cost was already clear. Letters home spoke of friends buried in shallow graves, of the screams of the wounded left on the field. Yet despite the horror, the brigade's reputation grew. By the time they marched toward their next battle, even Confederate commanders knew if you saw those black hats on the field, you were in for a fight. The summer of 1862 brought the Iron Brigade to the rolling hills of Virginia, where the war's true brutality would reveal itself. At Groveton, just before Second Bull Run, they stumbled into a fight they weren't ordered to take. The woods erupted with gunfire as Confederate forces ambushed their column. Instead of falling back, the men formed lines and returned fire round after round, smoke choking their lungs, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. When the fighting finally ceased, the ground was littered with bodies in blue and gray the brigade had held, but at a terrible price. Weeks later, at South Mountain, they charged uphill through a storm of bullets to dislodge Confederate defenders from a stone wall. Men dropped mid-stride, their screams lost in the roar of battle. Yet they kept advancing, their black hats making them easy targets but refusing to yield. By nightfall, they held the high ground, but the cost was staggering. One Wisconsin regiment lost a third of its men in a single hour. Then came Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. At dawn, the Iron Brigade pushed through cornfields where stalks snapped like bones under rifle fire. They fought in close quarters, bayonets flashing, boots slipping in blood-soaked soil. By midday, their ammunition ran low, and the dead lay in heaps. Still, they didn't break. When reinforcements finally arrived, what remained of the brigade was a shadow of its former strength. But their greatest trial was yet to come. At Gettysburg on the morning of July 1, 1863, they marched toward the sound of guns, unaware. They were walking into a slaughter. Outnumbered 3-1, they dug in along McPherson's Ridge. For hours, they endured artillery barrages and relentless infantry assaults. Men fired until their barrels overheated, then clubbed Confederates with rifle butts when the enemy got too close. By afternoon, entire companies had been wiped out. The survivors retreated only when ordered, carrying the wounded on their backs. When the battle ended, the Iron Brigade was shattered. Some regiments had lost over 80% of their men. The once proud, Ranks were now filled with hollow-eyed replacements. Yet their name had become legend, not for invincibility, but for sacrifice. As one survivor later wrote, *, we were called iron because we bent but never broke. The fields of Gettysburg had barely gone quiet when the true weight of the Iron Brigade's sacrifice became clear. Burial details moved through the wreckage, rolling stiffened corpses into shallow trenches. Men who had joked around campfires just days before now lay nameless under hastily marked boards. In the 24th Michigan alone, only 99 of the 496 who fought on July 1st answered roll call the next morning. The stench of death hung thick in the July heat, clinging to the survivors. Uniforms long after they marched away. Letters home told the story in shaky handwriting. A Wisconsin corporal described searching for his brother after the battle, only to find him slumped against a tree with a bullet through his temple. A surgeon from Indiana wrote to a widow that her husband fell without pain, though the blood stained. Pages of his field journal suggested otherwise. The home front reacted with a mix of pride and devastation. Towns that had sent whole companies of volunteers now draped buildings in black crepe. Replacements arrived fresh from the recruiting depots, wide-eyed boys who flinched at the distant thunder of artillery. The veterans watched them with hollow stares. These newcomers wore the same black hats, but they didn't yet understand what that meant. The brigade's original character was fading. The men who had earned its iron reputation were mostly dead or maimed. Hospital tents overflowed with amputees, their screams echoing through the night as surgeons worked by lantern light. A Minnesota lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We are no longer the Iron Brigade, just its ghost." Yet their legend grew. Northern newspapers called them the saviors of Gettysburg, though the survivors knew the truth was Messier. When General Meade reviewed the troops that August, even hardened officers choked up seeing the skeletal remains of what had once been the Union's hardest fighting unit. The Confederates remembered too. A captured rebel sergeant admitted they'd learned to fear them damned black hats more than any other Yankees. By 1864, the war had changed. The Iron Brigade fought on through the wilderness and Spotsylvania, but it was different now. The relentless grinding of trench warfare replaced their early open field heroics. When Lee finally surrendered at Appomattox, fewer than 24 of the original 1861 volunteers remained. They stood a little straighter when mustering out those who still could. Their backs ached from years of carrying knapsacks, their hands bore the scars of mini balls and bayonet wounds, but they'd earned the right to go home. The real memorials wouldn't be statues or speeches. They were the empty chairs at family tables, the widows who wore their mourning dresses until the fabric frayed, and the children who would know their fathers only through other men's stories. As one Indiana private scrawled on the back of his final letter home, "Tell them we held the line." The war ended in 1865. But for the survivors of the Iron Brigade, the battle was far from over. They came home to towns that both celebrated and misunderstood them. Parades welcomed them back, flags waving, bands playing, but the cheers couldn't drown out the nightmares. Many still woke in the dark, sweating, reaching for rifles that weren't there. The man who marched home wasn't the same boy who had left. Some tried to pick up where they'd left off. A Wisconsin sergeant returned to his family's farm, only to find his hands shook too badly to hold a plow. An Indiana lieutenant opened a hardware store but kept a loaded revolver under the counter, his nerves still raw from years of sudden violence. The government promised pensions, but the paperwork crawled through bureaucracies while men starved. A Michigan corporal, missing an arm and half his jaw, wrote bitterly to his congressman, *, they called us heroes when they needed us. Now we're beggars, *, others found solace in each other. Veterans' reunions became sacred gatherings, old men in faded uniforms retelling stories that grew sharper with time. They laughed about the stolen chickens and terrible coffee, but fell silent when someone mentioned Gettysburg. In 1888, hundreds returned to that Pennsylvania field, now dotted with monuments. They stood where their friends had died, tracing engraved names with calloused fingers. A newspaper reported that *, not a dry eye could be seen among them, even after 25 years. Asterisk monuments rose across the North Stone soldiers frozen mid-charge, plaques listing the dead. But the real legacy lived in quieter places. In a Wisconsin farmhouse, a granddaughter learned to read from her grandfather's war letters. In an Indiana church, a widow left fresh flowers on a grave marked "Unknown" every Memorial Day. And in Washington, the tattered flags they'd carry, bullet-riddled, blood-stained, were locked in glass cases, where schoolchildren pressed their noses against the glass and wondered. The last survivor died in 1932. By then, the world had moved on to new wars. But if you stand on Cemetery Ridge at sunset, when the wind rustles through the grass just right, you can almost hear it, the distant echo of shouted orders, the thunder of boots on hard earth, the defiant cry of men who refuse to break. Of the Iron Brigade is gone. But they are not forgotten. If this story of courage and sacrifice moved you, hit that like button. It helps others discover these forgotten heroes. What surprised you most about the Iron Brigade? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because history isn't just about the past, it's about the lessons we carry forward. See you in the next video.